Thank you, everyone, and I am your last speaker. Three messages that I want to start with, and then I'll tell you some stories about my own journey in Northern Ireland. The first question I think we need to ask when we talk peace is, who's at the table? Who's talking peace? How inclusive is it? Where are the gaps at the table? The second is, now that we have a table, what's being put on the table? Is everybody feeling that they've got something on this table, particularly if you're going to reach an agreement after 30 years of terrible conflict, which was the case in Northern Ireland? Did I see myself in the final agreement? Did the young people, my children, see themselves in the agreement? Did the women in the country see themselves in the agreement, as well as the political elites, as well as the ex-combatants, as well as those who had been involved for many years as constitutional politicians? And finally, we write the peace agreement. We put the words on the table, and what do they mean? And when we go out to the people after the agreement has been signed, and we ask them, as they did yesterday in Scotland, should you say yes or should you say no? Then we have to knock those doors, as I did, and translate these words into something that's meaningful for every person behind that door. So my story, where did I come from? I grew up in Northern Ireland. I was a very young woman when the Troubles started. I was a teenager. I was a pretty old woman by the time they stopped. So I knew nothing else. Violence was a way of life for me. Conflict was something I knew better than peace. In fact, as I discovered when I went to the table, it was easier probably to make war than it was to make peace. We were so unaccustomed to making peace. But how did I get to this table? Well, I had worked for over 30 years on various issues in the community, in the grassroots, civil society, as well as in the university, on this issue of how do we bring women into this process. There is much violence in the country that was happening outside in the streets, but there was much violence going on inside the homes. So it was to bring that out into the open, and it was also to bring people in from the cold. We formed a women's coalition, a political party of women, Catholic, Protestant, Nationalist, Unionist, British and Irish. It's always this or that. And we formed ourselves into a coalition, and we had 6 weeks to get elected. We did get elected. We went out to the people and we asked them, will you put us at the table? And they did. Let me tell you a story of what happened in that first year when we were at the table. There had not been an IRA ceasefire reinstated, and so one of the parties was not allowed to come to the table, because one of the conditions, which is right, is that you should negotiate under peaceful conditions. So it is good to have the ceasefire, and all parties who are party to the problem should become party to the solution. This party, Sinn Féin, had been excluded, and we spent that first year meeting them privately, secretly, and opening up back channels. Because we asked this question: the longer you're left out in the cold, how cold does it become? And how hot does the house inside become in terms of what people are saying about you? So we did this. We didn't ask for publicity. We did it behind the scenes. We opened up all kinds of channels. And I realized how important it was when President Mandela invited us to come to South Africa in 1997. We had 2 aeroplanes because the parties would not fly on the same planes together. We had 2 sets of dining rooms, and indeed poor President Mandela had to give his talk twice. He said, I have never seen anything like you people. We were all white, we were all Christians, supposedly, and we all spoke English. But we needed an interpreter. We certainly would have needed a 15-year-old wonderful mediator, and we needed probably a magical button, because they discovered they hadn't created 2 sets of men's toilets. That was the only thing they forgot about. And it created almost a breakdown in this military camp that we were locked up in for 3 days by President Mandela, and the de Klerk's people and Buthelezzi's people, and all of them were there to talk to us. So it would have been nice to have had a magical button to press to create a set of magical toilets where people couldn't see each other when they went to the toilet. But you don't have that. So what do you do instead? You talk, you communicate, you interpret, and you work across people's differences. And that's what we tried to do in the Women's Coalition. We had spent that year previously, we knew who we were talking to, and at times they called people like me Sinn Féin in a skirt. So there was obviously hostility, there was abuse, but you had to stand up to that and realize that if we don't talk, if we don't dialogue, if we can't reach out and find the humanity in the other person, as you have said, in the forest, then people will stay out in the cold. But we also decided to talk to the loyalists. And so in my home, on a very regular basis, I would invite male leaders with their wives to come and eat dinner. Some of these people had been difficult for some of the women to meet with on both sides. Some of them had killed people in our own families, amongst our own friends, in our own communities, and so there was a lot of hurt there. But we decided we still needed to do this, and eventually, one of those leaders who had come from the opposite side to me, who had been a stranger to me, became like a brother to me. So much so that when he died, I was asked by his wife to speak at his funeral, which gives you an indication of the journey that he made and that I made. And there was hardly a day in the peace talks that we did not phone each other and talk to each other. And there were times when other parties on that side, the loyalist side, had been excluded. And we decided during those times when they were put out of the room, again, that we would go out and talk to them until they came back into the room. All of the parties stayed. And eventually, we all became together signatories to the Good Friday Agreement in April of 1998. It was a Good Friday, but I said every day after that, and every week after that, we had to make more Good Fridays. So what was on the table? What did we put on the table that we could agree? And again, we had to ask ourselves, is there something on this, not just for the release of prisoners, for the reform of policing and security, but what will the future mean to our young people, to those who need a different kind of education, to the women of the country, to those who generally don't get spoken about and whose voices generally do not get heard. If all of us come in, then all of us will make this work together, but we need to see ourselves in this agreement. And so we signed that agreement, we went out to the people voted yes, but what did peace mean? So we talk about, let's talk peace, then we must walk peace. And for me, that has been one of the most difficult parts of our journey, because it can indeed mean different things to different people. It was a wonderful Good Friday, and we are still almost 20 years later, still trying to implement this process. It does need persistence, it does need patience, but it also does need the courage of lions for people to stand up and say, we are not going back. And so the message that I would say today, and to everyone who are struggling, as we have heard, and as I am now working with women from Syria, as I did last week, and I am also going into the prisons today, still going into the prisons in a different capacity than I did all those years ago. Then one of the channels that we decided to work on was to go into the prisons at the invitation of some of the parties, because the comrades inside in the prisons said, we don't understand what's happening at these big peace talks. We need people to come in and talk to us. We're very nervous about what's being agreed. And we took on that role. I still remember being very angry at the thought that prison officers had made me run the gauntlet of Alsatian dogs barking at my ankles and made me cross pornography that they had hung up on the walls in order for me to walk past with my two other women friends and colleagues, and then they locked us up for 3 hours in a mobile hut with 3 pretty dangerous men, and they walked away and took the key with them. But we did this, and we felt it was the right thing to do. We were criticized greatly for talking to terrorists, and as you've heard today, one person's terrorist can become another person's politician, can become somebody else's leader. So again, who we determine at different times in our struggles moves, and these are big challenges. So nothing about us without us is what I would say. And I think in the end, I take my courage from the women who I have worked with, and to listen to the voices of the women who I now work with in the Middle East, in all the countries that are suffering such terrible conflict. I say, let's talk peace. Thank you.